There's a pattern I keep seeing. A company runs a successful AI pilot. The results are real, the time savings are measurable, the people who ran it are proud of it. And then nothing happens. 6 months later, the pilot is still a pilot. Or it's been quietly archived. Or it's sitting in a slide deck that gets shown at internal meetings as evidence of innovation. The technology worked, so why didn't it scale? That question is more important than almost any technical question in AI right now. And the answer is almost never what people expect. My name is Ronald. What you're looking at is an AI clone, intentional, non-accidental. I use AI every day in real work, and this channel exists as a direct extension of that. I run Data Wonder, a company that builds AI automation and voice agent systems for businesses in insurance, accounting, healthcare industries, where the operational cost of doing things manually is very high and very visible. This channel exists because the gap between what AI can do and what companies actually use it for is enormous. And that gap isn't technical, it's organizational. If you want a calm, grounded analysis of what actually happens when companies try to deploy AI, not what should happen, but what does happen, subscribe. That's what this channel is. Now, back to the pilot problem. Most companies understand that AI pilots are supposed to lead somewhere. That's the whole point. You test in a controlled environment, you prove value, and then you roll it out. That's the theory, and in almost every industry I work in, that theory breaks down at the same point. Not during the pilot. The pilot succeeds, and then the company runs into something it didn't plan for. But I want to hold off on naming that thing for a moment, because to understand why it matters, you first need to see what a successful pilot actually looks like, and why success is part of the problem. Here's a typical scenario. An insurance company runs a pilot to automate a portion of their claims intake process. They pick a narrow, well-defined slice of the workflow. They give it to one team. They set clear success metrics: processing time, error rate, volume handled. The pilot runs for 8 weeks. The numbers come back strong. The team is satisfied. Leadership is impressed. Someone sends an email with the words, "Next steps" in the subject line. And this is where the story always slows down, because next steps require something the pilot didn't require: ownership. Real, accountable, politically committed ownership. And that is almost never in place when the pilot ends. The pilot was owned by the person who proposed it. Usually someone mid-level, technically curious, internally motivated. That person was allowed to run the experiment because it was low risk. Small scope. Contained. If it failed, nothing broke. If it succeeded well, now it belongs to everyone. And when something belongs to everyone, it often moves forward with the energy of no one. Have you seen this in your own organization? The pilot that proved something and then disappeared into a committee? The first reason pilots don't become infrastructure is ownership collapse. It's not that nobody cares. It's that the moment a pilot succeeds, it transitions from experiment to asset. And that transition requires someone to take on operational accountability. Procurement, IT integration, security review, change management, budget allocation. These are not exciting problems. They're not the problems the pilot champion was hired to solve. And they're usually not problems that get solved unless someone with actual authority decides to own them. But here's what I said earlier. The answer is almost never what people expect. Ownership collapse is real, but it's only the surface. There's a second layer underneath, and that's where things get interesting. I'll get to it. Let's stay on the surface a bit longer, because it's worth mapping correctly. The second reason pilots stall is integration friction. The pilot ran in a semi-isolated environment. It probably used sample data, or a controlled subset of real data. It had manual handoffs at the edges that were acceptable during testing. When you try to move it into production, into the real system, with real data flows, real exceptions, real volume, those manual handoffs stop being acceptable. And every one of them becomes a negotiation. IT needs to approve the API connection. Legal needs to review the data handling. Compliance wants a risk assessment. The vendor needs to be added to the approved supplier list. Each of these steps is individually reasonable. Collectively, they create a friction layer that can take months to work through. And during those months, the momentum from the pilot drains away. The team that was excited moves on to other things. The urgency disappears. And leadership, watching from above, starts to wonder if the pilot result was actually that significant after all. This is one of the more damaging dynamics I see. A pilot that succeeded technically gets reevaluated through the lens of organizational inertia. And sometimes it loses. If you think this sounds familiar, it probably is. This isn't an AI-specific problem. It happened with CRM implementations. It happened with ERP rollouts. It happens every time a company tries to move from experiment to infrastructure. What's different with AI is the pace at which pilots are running. The volume of experiments is much higher than it was 5 years ago, which means the graveyard of successful pilots is also much larger. That's actually worth sitting with for a moment. Companies are generating proof of value faster than they can act on it. That's a specific kind of organizational problem, and it's one that most companies haven't named yet. Now, the second layer I mentioned, the thing underneath, is ownership collapse and integration friction. The reason I've seen pilots fail, even when ownership was clear and integration was manageable, comes down to something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. It's the question of what the organization is actually optimizing for. Pilots are optimized for proof. They're designed to answer, does this work? That's a narrow question. It's answerable in 8 weeks with a small team and clean conditions. Infrastructure is optimized for reliability. It has to answer, does this work at scale, under pressure, with edge cases, with staff turnover, with regulatory changes, across multiple teams who weren't involved in the pilot? That's a fundamentally different question. And the gap between those two questions is not a technical gap, it's a design gap. The pilot wasn't designed to become infrastructure. It was designed to prove a point. And when the time comes to scale, you're not actually scaling the pilot, you're rebuilding it from scratch with different requirements, different stakeholders, and a much higher bar for failure. Most companies don't realize this going into the pilot. They assume that if the pilot works, scaling is mostly a matter of expanding access. Scaling requires a completely different architecture technically and organizationally. This is the part that's almost never discussed in AI deployment conversations. The pilot is a prototype. Infrastructure is a product. The distance between those two things is enormous. And here's the second-order effect of this dynamic. Companies that run pilots without planning for infrastructure end up in a cycle. They run a pilot, it succeeds, it stalls, it dies, and then 6 months later, someone proposes a new pilot on a slightly different problem. And the cycle repeats. Over time, the organization builds a tolerance for pilots and a distrust of outcomes. We've tried this before, becomes the default response to any new proposal, not because the ideas were bad, but because the infrastructure step never happened. The real cost of failed AI scaling isn't the cost of the pilot, it's the organizational cynicism that accumulates when proof of value never converts into operational reality. The companies that actually move AI from pilot to infrastructure share one characteristic that I've observed consistently. They treat the infrastructure question as a design constraint before the pilot starts, not after. They ask before anything is built. If this works, what would it take to run this permanently? Who owns it? How does it connect to our existing systems? What's the compliance path? What changes when the volume doubles? That planning doesn't slow the pilot down. It changes what the pilot is designed to test. The question isn't just, does this AI solution work? The question is, does this AI solution work in a way that can survive contact with our organization? Those are different questions, and the companies that ask the second one before they run the experiment are the ones whose pilots become infrastructure. If you found this useful, a like helps more people find it. And I want to hear from you. Has your company run a pilot that stalled? What was the reason for ownership, integration, or something else entirely? Leave it in the comments. I read them and I use them to decide what to cover next. If what I described today sounds like what's happening in your organization, successful pilots that go nowhere, automation that never makes it to production, I work with companies on exactly this. You can book a free call with me. The link is right below this video.